Today we're testing more games under Apple M1. As always, on screen are the specs of our machines. If you watched one of my previous episodes, you would have seen Metro Exodus running under Crossover 20. Well, now the game is available on Mac natively. Metro Exodus is sadly running under Rosetta 2.
Pity.
But its performance on M1 is still quite impressive. It's worth noting our capture card hated this game and was unable to detect any footage from our Mac Mini and MacBook Air. Only our MacBook Pro, but the stupid capture card outputs the video frame rate to 24 FPS. I don't know why it was just specific to this game. Anyway, if you look at the Steam FPS counter at the top left, you'll see how it's actually performing. First, we tried playing at 1080p medium settings and the game will get a little over 30 FPS. If you want a higher frame rate, we recommend playing at 1600 by 900 and either medium or high settings. At medium settings, the frame rate goes anywhere from about 40 to 50 FPS, and high about 35 to 50 depending on the situation that you're in. Obviously, gunfights will lower the frame rate. It's not every day you get a big AAA game like this on Mac, especially a first-person shooter, so try it out as it runs pretty well on M1. Recently, Path of Exile was updated to version 3.13.2. This update now allows M1 Macs to play Path of Exile through Rosetta. A native version is said to come in a future update. The performance is better than I expected actually. On my 2019 MacBook Pro, the game is only playable at 720p low settings and gets around 30 FPS. Here, the frame rate is usually a little over 60 at max settings. However, I noticed some monsters with overwhelming attack animations, such as the glutinous gull, cause the game to stutter at times. Plus, there are some noticeable graphical bugs right now. For example, when you first launch Path of Exile, textures will take a few seconds to load in. Some of your special ability animations may not appear at first, such as my ground slam here, and some textures flicker on the ground. It will be interesting to see if these issues are fixed with the native Apple Silicon version later, and it will be more interesting to see if Path of Exile 2 comes to Mac as well. Here is an example of a new game with native M1 support on Steam, Spacebase Startopia. The problem here is that the Steam application is still running under Rosetta and doesn't support native M1 games yet. This is the same for most game stores, apart from the Mac App Store. So if you try to launch Spacebase Startopia through Steam, it will crash. You can get around this though by going into the root folder and launching Spacebase Startopia that way. This will bypass the Steam interface. The game seems to work just fine, but I can't track the game's frame rate with the Steam FPS counter. If Valve get their act together and update Steam, we should see way more games get native M1 support very quickly, or more quickly than we've seen so far. Recently, Apple Arcade received a massive expansion with 32 new games. NBA 2K21 is one of these. It provides the most realistic sports simulation experience and the best looking graphics on arcade yet. Since the game is more tailored towards mobile hardware, the graphics quality is not quite on par with the PC or console version, but it's not far off. 2K did say the game targets 60 FPS here. However, I feel this is only for gameplay. When the game transitions to camera footage, the frame rate does drop a little bit. We are running the game at ultra high settings for this video, but this frame rate drop happens on any graphical preset on M1. Once again, YouTuber Andrew Tai has shared some of his Windows gameplay footage from his MacBook Air. Here we have Yakuza 0 running through Crossover 20 and Steam. Crossover 20's latest update also fixed controller support on M1, so the footage here was played with an Xbox One controller. The game is being played at 1080p and the high quality preset. Sadly, the Steam FPS counter is not working under Crossover still. However, from the naked eye, I'd say the frame rate is 60 FPS. Yakuza 0 is set before the events of the original game, and is probably the most popular game in this action-adventure series, so you can be happy it plays really well here. GWENT is now available to download on Apple M1 Macs through the Mac App Store. Mind you, it's not the official desktop version, you'll be playing the iPad version. It still has full crossplay and synchronization functionality with other supported platforms, i.e. PC, iPhone and iPad, and Android. What's interesting though is I believe this is the first iPhone and iPad game on M1 to be playable with a 16:9 aspect ratio instead of using the 4:3 aspect ratio from an iPad. Some may say it was lazy to just port the mobile version, but really it's not that much different and plays just like any other platform. In February, Transport Fever 2 was ported to Mac. Mac users can now start building their own transport empire and join an ever-growing global community of active players here. This release comes with Molten VK support. Molten VK is a software library which allows Vulkan applications to run on top of Metal. So it performs fairly well. At high settings, we're seeing 30 to 50 FPS and medium 40 to 60 FPS. Not bad for a game that is quite CPU bound. Doom has been tested on practically everything, from a PC, console, mobile device, an Apple Watch, a calculator, a printer, a digital camera from 1998, and even a pregnancy test. And now it's time to try it on Apple M1. Doom, or Ultimate Doom, is not shy of being available on Mac. It was actually ported to PowerPC Macs back in 1994, but never saw a native Intel version. Well, thanks to GZDoom, a modern source port of the Doom engine is available, GZDoom. GZDoom runs fine on Apple M1, thanks to recently being updated to 64-bit. But this is an Intel app running under OpenGL. A staff member from Elverels, the people who brought us Divinity Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3, has been working on a native Apple Silicon version that now supports the Metal API. This build of GZDoom is running at 60 FPS here, just like the OpenGL version. Both versions should also be able to get 120 FPS on an external monitor with a high refresh rate, but the M1 version uses considerably less resources to achieve this. We're seeing about 50% more performance over OpenGL, but this M1 build has two issues right now: no sound and some graphical bugs. Once this build is complete, it will be uploaded to the GZDoom website. For now, I have a tutorial in the description if you want to play the Intel version. This game is really old, and it's not taxing for any hardware really, but it's still cool to see it being translated across so many different operating systems and hardware. I was able to get Wreckfest working on my MacBook Pro with Crossover and Steam. However, it has a weird visual blur bug going on. What's weird is that the game is only blurry during racing gameplay. It's not present with the user interface, menus, the garage, when using the photo mode, or during camera footage at the start of an event. I tried disabling all advanced settings, lowering the resolution, opening in safe mode, but I could not get rid of this weird bug. If anyone has any ideas, let me know in the comments. Apart from that, the game does run really well at 1080p high settings, but I imagine the blur bug might be helping the game's performance. In macOS Big Sur 11.3 beta, or the final release, you can now play iPhone and iPad games with your mouse and keyboard. Mind you, it works best for games with full controller support. Here we have Unruly Heroes, and it's fully playable with my keyboard. WASD to move around, space to jump, Q to attack, tab to switch characters, and so forth. Right now you can't change any of the inputs, which is a little annoying, as sometimes games are configured really awkwardly with the keyboard. What about third-person games? In GTA Vice City, you can pan the camera around with your mouse, but the Mac mouse cursor is still visible, which is a little distracting. You can move around with WASD keys, enter with E, run with space, and so on. The support is still not perfect for these types of games, especially first-person shooters, but it's a step in the right direction. What about games with no controller support? Dirt Bike Unchained is one of these, but the game should automatically enable touch and motion alternatives, or you can enable it manually. Having this enabled will replicate touch inputs with your keyboard. In this racing game, you can accelerate with space, time your landings with space, and successfully make all those corners with space. Touch and motion alternatives works best with games that require only a single touch input. Ori and the Blind Forest works wonderfully on M1 via Parallels. The game's requirements are fairly low, and it supports an older version of DirectX 9.0c, but still, all this is running under layers of emulation, so I still find it impressive. At 1080p, the game is locked to 60 FPS. If you want to play Ori and the Will of the Wisps, it's not doing so well, sadly. While its requirements are not crazy, if you compare it to the first games, the requirements have pretty much doubled, and the game now supports DirectX 11. While the Steam FPS counter is not working, it's still really easy to say the game is not really playable. Sometimes it's a stuttery mess, and then the frame rate becomes more stable randomly. It's even worse on Crossover 20, as the main character is invisible. So definitely play Ori and the Blind Forest. While the main protagonist is not as agile and exciting to control in the first game compared to the second, I found the story is much more interesting, which is often more important. Before macOS 11.3 beta, or the final release, I was unable to play this game on M1 as it always crashed. Now it's up and running. Unreal Tournament was one of the first games to support the Metal API back in January 2017, and thanks to Unreal Engine 4 support, graphically it holds up very well. Even with all this support, the game is almost unplayable on most Intel Macs. Even on Macs with dedicated graphics cards, the performance is just awful, and there are some graphical bugs. So I'm super impressed to see how well it's playing here. You can enable an in-game FPS counter by using the console and typing stat FPS. To get over 40 FPS, it's best to play the game at 900p and medium settings. It's not amazing performance, but it's actually a lot better than the majority of Intel Macs. Sadly, this amazing free multiplayer FPS game was cancelled as Epic transitioned to Fortnite, so it most likely will never be updated. Still, give it a go as it's criminally underrated because of Fortnite's success, and it runs pretty well here. In February last year, Frostpunk finally arrived on Mac. Sadly, it's running under Rosetta 2, which is somewhat limited by its performance. Across all M1 models, you'll want to play at the following settings on screen, about 720p and about medium-high settings, to get around 30 FPS, even after long play sessions. The performance isn't anything to be excited about, but it's a massive step up from playing this game on recent Intel MacBook Pros. If you've never played this game, it's a survival simulation experience. It's super hard and brutal and will hurt you, but you will like it and come back for more. Trust me. Beyond Blue is an amazing underwater adventure game on Apple Arcade. Like NBA 2K21, it provides fairly realistic locations that are actually inspired by the documentary Blue Planet 2. Recently, the game was updated to support M1 natively. Sadly, the game only targets 30 FPS on Apple M1. I wish it was 60, but oh well. Apart from that, it runs absolutely fine with no issues. Mind you, the Rosetta 2 version performed just fine as well. But I guess this version is just future-proofing it for Apple Silicon Macs. The Last Campfire also has been updated for M1. On iOS, this game is capped at 30 FPS, but on M1 it plays at 60 FPS. Plus, the Mac version lets you customize the graphics, and it easily handles the highest settings. The Last Campfire provides one of the best stories out there about a lost ember trapped in a puzzling place. Search for meaning and a way home. You don't want to miss this one. Devotion is a psychological horror game that was banned on Steam a few years back, and recently was re-released on the developer's own website. This version now comes with Mac support. Sadly, the game is not native for M1, and I can't confirm what the graphics API is for this one, and I am unable to track the FPS. So, keeping that in mind, it's worth noting. Across all our M1 models, the game will see noticeable FPS drops when you first launch the game, especially on MacBook Air. However, after a few minutes, the frame rate does even out. Puzzle adventure experience The Talos Principle is performing really weirdly on Apple M1. The game has a handy benchmark feature, and we can use it to track the frame rate. As you can see, the game is stuck at 24 FPS on a 13-inch MacBook Pro, and 25 FPS on a MacBook Air. This is the same on any graphical preset too, from Ultra to Low. Weird, seeing as this game supports the Metal API. Right off the bat, Hellblade is not really playable on M1, but I wanted to show it as it's impressive that this blockbuster video game is even working in the first place via Parallels 16. The game requires 8 GB of memory on Windows and a 2 GB or better graphics card. We can only allocate 4 GB to the virtual machine. So on Andrew Ty's MacBook Air, at 720p and low settings, the frame rate looks to be around 20 to 30 FPS. Exploring is fine, but engaging in combat can be difficult at this low frame rate. On my MacBook Air, I can play at 720p medium settings, and the frame rate looks to be around 30 to 40 FPS. It's better, but it's still not that enjoyable, especially at this low resolution. I imagine if you have 16 GB of memory, it could be a little better, but I don't expect it would be that much. Hitchhiker is one of the few games on Apple Arcade with an in-game FPS counter, the other being Sociable Soccer. We tested the game across all our M1 machines at 1080p and very high settings. Strangely, the game is stuck at 56 FPS on all these Macs. Still, it's completely playable. Hitchhiker is a weird game, but it has some important messages to share about intimate relationships, family, social media, and dreams. I highly suggest taking a look. Not much needs to be said about Enter the Gungeon. It plays like a dream on Apple M1. Steam says the game is not compatible and may be 32-bit, but this is obviously completely false as it's running here. It's a 64-bit application with OpenGL support. So many of you wanted to see Valheim in one of these videos. I don't know if that's how you pronounce the name. The game is only playable under Parallels, but it has major graphical bugs. You can enable an in-game FPS counter by pressing F2, and as you can see, it has abysmal performance, even at the lowest quality preset. So there, don't play it on M1. The game is in early access and playing under a virtual machine, so I'll give it some slack. It's not all bad news though, as a native Mac version might be in the works. If you look on SteamDB, a Mac depot has been submitted, and you can see all of the game's folder content here. The same thing happened with Metro Exodus, and now it's on Mac, so let's hope the same thing happens here. Intruder is a very overlooked FPS game on Steam. It's like an indie version of Rainbow Six Siege, and it's available on Mac. Its biggest downfall is that it's running on OpenGL, which is hurting its performance. It's playable, but really it should be getting a significantly higher frame rate. At fantastic quality, the game sees a little over 40 FPS, and at simple quality, 60 to 70 FPS. Still, give it a go as it's really fun, but make sure you can use voice chat as the game is built around teamwork. YouTuber Andrew Tai tried to get Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag working on his MacBook Air back in November 2020, but it wouldn't launch at the time. Now running macOS 11.3 beta, the game is now working under Parallels, albeit with the lowest graphics settings and 1344 by 756 resolution. The game still won't work under Crossover 20 if you're wondering. Fun fact, Assassin's Creed 2 and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood had a native Mac version back in the day. I really hope Ubisoft consider supporting Mac again, but I imagine we're not at the top of their porting list. One of the best RPGs in years just got better with a big update, adding full voice acting and new quests that dramatically change the game world. The Mac App Store version is a native M1 application, however on Steam, Epic Games Store and GOG, it's running under Rosetta 2. Still, the game can play at 1080p max settings on any platform and get a locked 60 FPS. Before this update, anti-aliasing had to be off to get 60 FPS. Now we can have anti-aliasing up to 8 times. Gravia, or Gravia, is the latest game to be inspired by Portal. It adds black holes to the sci-fi puzzle genre, called rifts. You'll use your sci-fi glove to generate rifts to move obstacles or yourself at high speed to solve puzzles. Gravia may not be the most graphically advanced game out there, but where it shines is the technology behind the advanced physics and what a black hole might look like in a closed environment. Sadly, the game is powered by OpenGL, so to get 60 FPS, you will have to play at medium settings, which means the black holes won't look as impressive. Playing at high, the frame rate will range from 30 to 50 FPS. I'm disappointed with City Skylines. It added metal support in beta in June 2017, and recently it has gone back to OpenGL support.
How disappointing.
This is hindering the performance on M1. At high, we're seeing 25 to 35 FPS, medium 30 to 40 FPS, and low the same, about 30 to 45 FPS. It's playable, but it could be so much better. Maybe the developer ran into some issues with the Metal API. I don't know. Layers of Fear 1 was ported to Mac by Aspyr in 2016, and I was surprised Layers of Fear 2 didn't get the same treatment. I suppose this new game has somewhat more photorealistic graphics, so maybe some Intel Macs just could not handle it. Well, you can play the game on M1 via Parallels, but it does have some issues. Technically, it's not really playable. At 720p and high settings, the game's performance will at one moment be fine, and then suddenly the frame rate will drop dramatically. Lowering the graphics preset doesn't really help either. Narita Boy is a hot new indie adventure on Steam. I didn't expect to love it so much. Sure, the controls are clunky, but the art style is mesmerizing, the music is thumping, and the story is simple yet effective. Sadly, the Steam FPS counter is not working here, but if I was to predict, it's hitting 60 FPS with no issues. Our last game is Little Nightmares. Thanks again to Andrew for sharing his footage from his MacBook Air. And Parallels, the game runs perfectly fine, and there is not much else to say about that. Honestly, it always surprised me that Little Nightmares never came to Mac. It doesn't require a powerful machine to enjoy it. Then again, the studio behind this game have not ported many of their games to Mac. I believe only 2. So there's that. I really hope they consider us in the future, and may this video be an example of what the game could be like if it was ported to Mac. What do you think of all this? Are you impressed with the performance or disappointed with what you've seen? Let me know in the comments. I honestly don't know when my next video will be out for testing games on M1, as I've shown pretty much all the popular games that there is to be seen, and not many new graphically advanced games come to Mac that often. Who knows, maybe my next episode will be testing games on the next Apple Silicon chipset. Anyway, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with everything Apple gaming related. My name is Stewie, and thanks for watching.